Well, we're back looking at the 65-foot turntable, and well, here's the thing. I screwed up a little bit. I failed to recognize the fundamental engineering differences between an A-frame versus a pit turntable. The standard Denver and Rio Grande 65-foot turntable is a classic pit turntable in that it rides in a deep pit, and the outside edges ride on a ring rail, so the weight of the locomotive and the entire bridge is carried on the wheels at the far ends of the turntable. While there is a center pivot here, the center pivot has to be free to rotate around like a ball joint. Otherwise, there's going to be a binding between the outer ring rail and the inner pivot. Now here's the turntable they have at Carson City, Nevada. This is an older type of turntable, usually made out of wood, called an A-frame or Gallows turntable, even sometimes called a balance turntable. And if you look closely, while there's a shelf there for a ring rail, there is no ring rail. The entire bridge here is supported only in the center, which is why there are these huge cables holding up the ends of the turntable, because the weight of the locomotive is being entirely carried on the pivot at the center of the turntable, not at the ends. So here we can see the center pivot, sometimes called the spider, and it actually is something of a ring rail. It's just a small ring rail right at the very center. Again, you can see a shelf over here where you might expect to see a ring rail, but no, there's nothing there. It's just a cement shelf. Now here we can see a Gallows turntable. It was built by our good friend Steve that was on his ON3 railroad. And you can see that center pivot, and you can see that it's actually a really small ring rail. And here you can see why they called this type of system a spider, because on that inner ring rail, there's a series of train wheels that ride on that rail that are suspended in bearings, and this is what carries the entire weight of the locomotive, is the spider. And so at the very center of the bridge is a structure. This is why it was sometimes called the Gallows. And from that center structure, cables go out to the far ends of the bridge, so that the entire structure here becomes, I guess, something of a seesaw, if you will, but the weight is being carried entirely in the center, meaning that the locomotive on the bridge has to be absolutely centered so that the bridge is balanced at the middle, which is why these were sometimes called a balance turntable. So here's where I messed up. So here's my turntable. It's a pit-style turntable with an outer ring rail, but at the very center there, I also have a rigid pivot like you would find on a Gallows turntable. And I'm using that center pivot to drive the entire bridge around using the motor here. But that center bushing or bearing is very rigid. If you put any kind of pressure across this laterally, it's going to bind up. I've also now added a ball bearing at that center plate to help carry this weight, but it does require that the entire bridge be balanced just like you'd find on a Gallows turntable. And yet I also have a ring rail with wheels riding on it. And so if there's any irregularity at all in this outer ring rail, if it travels especially upward, it's going to put pressure on that center bushing. And I discovered that when I was setting up the height here, that you can actually hear it binding against the ring rail as I'd rotate the bridge around, even though the height of the ring rail here is only a few 10,000ths of an inch too high. So my solution was to lower that ring rail, just take a little teeny tiny bit off the top, and that did stop this binding. But when I put a very heavy locomotive on here, unless that locomotive was perfectly balanced at the center, just like it would be on a Gallows turntable, any weight at all on the ring rail would cause the center bushing here to bind up and stall the motor. And if I wanted the weight to be carried on the ring rail as it would be on an actual 65-foot turntable, I would have to completely redesign my center pivot here so that the motor mechanism and center bearing and everything would be free to pivot around like a ball joint, which I assume is how the center pivot works on an actual 65-foot turntable. And so the workaround that I've come up with is to raise the entire turntable bridge up slightly so that there's never any weight carried on the ring rail except when a locomotive is pulling on the bridge or off of the bridge. Otherwise, it's free to rotate without the wheels ever touching the ring rail. I've also added a rather substantial ball bearing now at the center to help carry that weight, because sometimes there's a locomotive sitting on here that weighs 50 pounds. But as long as that locomotive is perfectly centered above the ball bearing, it goes around smoothly. And so what I've done is sort of accidentally created a balanced turntable or A-frame turntable. But it doesn't have to have the gallows and the complete A-frame, because the bridge here is 1.5 inches thick plywood, and so it's not going to bend and distort. And the only time that the wheels actually touch the ring rail is when a locomotive is pulling onto or off of the bridge, and then the entire bridge does flex downward, which would put a bind on the center bearing, but it's not moving at this point, and the locomotive can freely ride onto the bridge, and as soon as it's centered, then the wheels lift back up off the ring rail. If you look very closely here at Carson, you can actually see when the bridge lifts up and starts to float as it's balanced. So the best laid plans, as they say, often go awry. In this particular case, I accidentally created sort of a hybrid turntable, half pit turntable with a ring rail and half gallows turntable, which is anchored at the very center and has to be balanced. Hopefully this has been informative. It's certainly been informative for me. I know the difference between the turntables now. Anyway, bottom line is it works. It was kind of a rethink and a re-engineering of a problem that I didn't know I was creating by, frankly, designing the thing wrong in the first place. But anyway, it is what it is, and it's working. That's the bottom line. The rethink has brought it around. If you're not a subscriber to the channel, please subscribe to the channel. There's more coming on the turntable, believe it or not. We've been on this for quite some time. Anyway, at the end of this, I'm going to put together a complete turntable show, a composite of all of this stuff. And hopefully you'll want to see that. So if you're not a subscriber, please subscribe by clicking on the upcoming blue button. Zoink! Right there, the blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring. And Karen and I will see you here on Sunday. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.